Tell us about, so that it was that hospitalization after she went in when she fell, and then what brought her to ultimately passing away. That's going to be a key point about all of this, where there are signs and there are things to pay attention to, and there are concrete steps along the way. And, a lot of times if we're not paying attention, or collectively there's no guidance, then all of a sudden it seems like it came out of nowhere when actually the story was unfolding all along. Tell me about that final phase.
So she had to go to the hospital to get checked out to make sure she didn't have anything fractured. And then she immediately was admitted into a rehab, which was very difficult because now she had the psychiatric diagnosis following her. So it was such a difficult situation, but we were able to get her into the William Bremen rehab. And with the help of this geriatric case manager. And so she was now not walking at all. She basically was walking with a walker up until this point. And now, as I visited her while she was in the rehab, I could just see physically the decline, and they would push her in the wheelchair to the window, and she would just sit and cry and cry. And it was heart-wrenching. And, why are you doing this to me? Like I was keeping her there. And, but now she had to stay there because the Jewish Tower absolutely would not let me bring her back. And so we were busy trying to find this assisted living, and we eventually did find assisted living, and it was really horrific. All she wanted to do was go back and see her home, but we couldn't take her into the building because of COVID, and also by direction of the folks at the rehab and the assisted living, the best transition for someone in her situation is to go to the new home. Because if she were to go back to her new home, she may fight you on wanting to leave again and so forth. And it was just the whole thing, looking back, it's like that we even survived this. Myself, my sister Lisa was here in Atlanta at the time, helping me to a certain degree, although she was at much higher risk for COVID than I was because she has some high blood pressure. So I was the one who was more interfacing on a regular basis with my mom. And so then we moved her into the assisted living, and she seemed to be, after about 4 weeks or so, she seemed to be adapting, and she was eating and she was making friends. They actually had given her a nickname. They called her Brooklyn. And, it's kind of like, the Jewish Tower. She was like the mayor there. Now she was like becoming the mayor of this place. And, but I visited her on a Sunday. And so I was fortunate enough that this assisted living was independently owned, privately owned. So they knew the importance of their residents being able to see family.
Yeah.
And so they would bring her out. I couldn't go in, but they would bring her out, and it was chilly. It was winter. It was November. And, we were talking about Thanksgiving, and she was, excited about the idea that they were going to let her come to my house for Thanksgiving. But on that Sunday, I brought her a pastrami sandwich. She loved all these things that she shouldn't have been eating. I would bring to her, and she would eat because I looked at it like, this could be her last pastrami sandwich, and we would laugh. But it really was her last pastrami sandwich. So that day, she started to complain before I left that she wasn't feeling so well in down here. She would point down here, and I'd be like, well, do you think it's your bladder? And she'd had many bladder infections. And so I spoke to the nurse there and told her, and there was a nurse practitioner on staff that was going to come see her on Tuesday. And on Tuesday, she was feeling terrible. And I was like, you know what, Mom, maybe we shouldn't wait till the nurse practitioner comes in this afternoon. Maybe we need to go to the hospital. And she's like, absolutely, I am not going to the hospital. Like basically saying over my dead body, I will not go to the hospital. So she saw the nurse practitioner. They put her on some kind of an antibiotic. But by Friday, she was almost not talking. And actually, over the course of this time, and now looking back, even before all of these sort of happenstances, if you will, while she was depressed, she stopped engaging as much. She stopped talking as much. And obviously, this was even before the pandemic. And Kayla, the little girl that I mentored, noticed that, because she used to always ask Kayla so many questions. It would drive Kayla crazy about, how's school and what's your favorite subject? And she'd ask her the same questions over and over again because she'd forget that she had asked her, and that was part of the dementia. But it's so crystal clear to me now that she was just really riding a decline. And I'd like to say I wish that it had happened without all of these injuries and these happenstances, but I guess this was all part of how it was having to sort of play out for her.
Yeah, and actually everyone has a different trajectory. And we were talking, you had mentioned, someone might have cancer. That plays out, not all, things are all different. This is not an uncommon story, actually. This is something that unfolds over time. Dementia has its own trajectory, but this is not an uncommon story. You mentioned key points along the way, disinterest. I mean, even things that they frame in psychiatric terms of depression or, the beginnings of kind of altered thinking, cognitive issues. You mentioned weight loss, not really having an interest in eating and drinking to the same degree. A fall is a significant event. So you take all of these different things along the way and you put them together. A really significant one was the loss of mobility after the fall, going from being somewhat ambulatory to no longer being ambulatory.
She absolutely had no...
Even the infection that you mentioned too, right?
Strength.
These are things that accrue. These are typical processes that we see as someone who is declining. And if you have that viewpoint of what to look for, the picture actually becomes quite clear.
Right.
And it leads you to that place where you can get the timing correct on, even, okay, we think that they're quite imminent or we've got days to weeks at this point. Tell me about the very end, because I think one of the key things that struck me in your story also is along the way, no one was noticing any of this.
Yeah.
No guidance from professionals also.
I mean, I kept in regular contact with, all of her physicians, and I was the one who took her to all of her doctor's appointments, and at no point did anybody say to me that, your mother's really in the last stage of her life. And I mean, it was really pretty obvious, and I certainly knew she wasn't getting any younger. But I certainly did not anticipate what would have unfolded, but the realization of going from somewhat ambulatory now to literally being wheelchair bound basically was her death, although she was still living. And I guess her own body's reaction, but I think that infection now, so fast forward to Friday, she had to go to the hospital because she was in such terrible pain. And so the helper, I had now gone back to work. Previous to that, I had taken a year off, and now I had engaged with working again after a year. And so the helper, I met her at noon at the hospital. I stayed with her from noon till 11 p.m. that night. And during that time, she would become very combative. and angry, and she was almost trying to pull out the IVs and so forth. And I tried to explain, Mom, this is all, we need to get fluids in you. We're getting heavy duty antibiotics. This is all so you'll get better, so I can take you home, so we can spend more time together. And they're going to open up. And I would talk about, I always wanted her to have things to look forward to. So I would plan activities, and she was calling out for my sister Lisa, and then she would call me Lisa, and all part of that was her and the reaching. She was doing this reaching out of the bed, and I later read that also is a sign.
Another aspect, you just mentioned it, this was preceding her passing away. There is terminal agitation. There's agitation that we often see in patients when they are about to pass. And then once they ease out, if we can get that agitation calm, often with medications, it allows the process of transitioning to start. And that can be longer or shorter, but we see that commonly. Again, giving it a name instead of just saying, as perhaps in the hospital where they just said, well, she's got a urinary tract infection and we're treating, and she seems to be combative, starting to frame it and saying, no, this is actually an infection at the end of life. And she's also manifesting terminal agitation, even questioning at that juncture, should we be giving fluids and antibiotics? There are questions that come up,
Yeah,
when
well,
she
was a DNR, so we had that in place. And so what happened was the next morning, and so thankfully, again, Piedmont Hospital was the only hospital that separated the COVID patients from the regular patients, allowing the regular patients to have a visitor. I can't imagine, and it probably would have happened sooner, quite frankly, though, had I not been engaging with her. So it's almost like there's a part of me that felt like I was prolonging her life and not even realizing it. I'm not saying that I would have abandoned her by any means, but, looking back, the idea of the holding on, she, the purpose, that she had.
Yeah, as your mom, as a mother, having her daughter close to her, there is something absolutely about proximity and not being able to let go as easily. We've seen that too. So what happened then at Piedmont Hospital?
So what happened there was they were going to wheel her up. Now they finally had a room for her. And if you can imagine, it was very chaotic in the emergency room. And there were emergencies, and I'm sure there were COVID patients. And I almost kind of took over for the nurses in there. And so I was now having to leave the hospital, having been with her the whole day. And I remember her saying, don't leave me, please don't leave me. And I was like, Mommy, I'll be back tomorrow, I promise. The visiting hours start at 10 o'clock. I will be here at 10 o'clock. And she's like, do you promise? And I was like, I promise. That was the last conversation that we ever had. And so when I got there on Saturday, she wasn't really very responsive. She knew I was there, but she wasn't talking at all. And again now, she was dying. But nobody told me that she was dying. And what they did tell me was she began to, now they had given her fluids, she was retaining fluid. And so they had to stop giving her fluid. And at this point now, she was DNR. And so that's when, sort of by noon, 1 o'clock, I asked to speak to the nurse and had the nurse call the hospitalist. And I asked the hospitalist, oh, do you think that I need to be talking to hospice? I mean, is my mother dying? And he never said. He never confirmed that she was dying or that the prognosis was death. And I think that there was a part of me that went right into task mode Now I'm going to find the hospice. I'm going to set hospice. I'm going to get her back to the assisted living. And so I had settled in my mind that she'll have a very peaceful demise at the assisted living, or maybe she will get better. There were so many thoughts in my mind. But I definitely knew and was familiar with hospice at end of life because my father, hospice was actually brought to him, or the hospice nurses who are specially skilled in end of life, as you know, were brought into him in his hospital room, and we came to call them his angels. And I would call and say, are your angels there? And he would, at the point before he passed, he would joke around, and he was so silly, and he was like, well, I like the one that has, red hair better than the one that has brown hair and all that. But anyway, I digress. But in regard to my mom, she was dying before my eyes. And it's almost like I knew it, but I didn't want to accept it. It was almost like having an outer body experience, that it was actually happening. Kind of like the idea of when someone's going to give birth, you're excited and the water breaks and it's happening. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that we should be excited that she was dying, but it was happening. Mm-hmm. And
that
nobody
moment,
told me.
Yeah, that moment that everybody fears or thinks about or puts in a way that's kind of like you said, just it's nebulous, but it's something that will happen. And then you say it's happening, but then you have no guidance and support, or no one around you is in the same state of, is this what's going on?
Yeah, it was so bizarre.
It's a surreal film, probably.
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, looking back, and I think to myself, they didn't ask if I wanted to see a chaplain, mm-hmm. Or anybody, a religious person or anything. But it's as if no one told me that she was dying. So naturally, maybe they wouldn't ask for that. Mm-hmm. But what I also realized is I never saw a person that was actually dying before. Now, I'd been a hospital rep, and I knew of people dying in the hospital, and I have seen people being wheeled, covered to the mortuary, but I had never actually seen a real dying person, except on television. So what happened at this point is I had set up the hospice. They were going to come to the assisted living. We were going to get her discharged Sunday, and the doctor agreed to sign off on that, and she would be transported back. And so I got in bed with her and was talking to her, and found myself saying to her, Mom, I know you're so tired, and if you're too tired, to go back to the assisted living facility, it's okay. And I almost believe I can't believe that I was saying that. It was almost, I was in disbelief as I was saying it to her, but I almost felt as like intuitively as if I knew I needed to. And I called her grandkids, and she reacted when she heard their voices, and they were all crying. And I think they all were almost more prepared for it than I was at that point, because I really thought I was going to be meeting her back at her assisted living Sunday morning. So I went home, and about 8:30 checked on her, and they said stable, no change. So in my mind, stable meant, okay, she's good to be discharged in the morning, and then we're going to have hospice come in, and we have more time. And at about 10:30, I was fast asleep, and my phone rang, and my heart dropped into my stomach. And the nurse said, I don't even remember her name. This is so-and-so from Piedmont Hospital. I'm very sorry your mom is gone. And I remember reacting like, what do you mean she's gone? She's supposed to go back to the assisted living tomorrow. And, hospice is coming. And I didn't believe them. And I don't know why my reaction was, I have to go see her. I have to see this with my own eyes that she's really gone. Forgive me. And so I went to the hospital, and I was running down the corridor, and people were yelling at me, and they were like, ma'am, you have to slow down. You can't run. This is a hospital. And, I realize now if she was already passed, I don't know what I was running to, because there was nothing I could do at that point. And so I went into her room, and she really looked really kind of pale, that ashen kind of look that a person who's passed away looks like. But in some respects, she looked peaceful. There's a part of me that wishes I didn't take a picture, but I did. And showed it to my brother, and he was like, you can't unsee that. And it was just the whole trying to wrap my head around that she was really gone. And, yeah, and that's...
Just want to give you a moment.
Okay.
That's a really powerful story. Sometimes there's not anything you can say. I told you when we first spoke about this a little bit, I told you I grieved for that because I know that with guidance and information, things can be done differently.
Yeah.
It's just there's a lack of knowledge out there about dying and a lack of acknowledgement.
Well, I almost realized that at some certain point, her internist could have said, you know what, I think your mom needs to see a palliative care physician. And had we been in touch with somebody like yourself, all of this would have made much more sense.
Yeah. It's really creating the right narrative. Anything in medicine isn't it? I mean, at the end of the day, there are people who struggle with symptoms for a long time, and it doesn't get put into a narrative unless someone knows, or being given a diagnosis. This is being given a diagnosis of decline and dying. But, you'd be amazed also. I mean, I talk to a lot of people where, for all sorts of reasons, they don't want to hear how to diagnose decline and don't want to hear how to manage decline or talk about dying. But there are patterns, there are recognizable symptoms, there are things to do. You talked about terminal agitation, or there are things that can be done, even medications at the end of life. You said she went in tremendous pain. And if her kidneys hadn't been working well, there are medications to give in lieu of maybe morphine, things that you can do and dose carefully, and decisions that can be made in managing these situations. And that is really why I think this discussion is so fundamentally important. I want to ask you a really important question, too. You had mentioned how, maybe your faith, you were looking for guidance in some sense, perhaps, from that, and that there's an embracing of life, but maybe kind of not really wanting to talk about death per se. Can we talk about that a little bit? How because that is also helping people cope. And if there's no discussion of decline, no discussion of dying, but just a celebration of life, and everyone needs to remain silent about dying, and we don't discuss this, then what happens? Because we all die, right? So then we have to reconcile faith, we have to reconcile our beliefs, try to figure out a way to kind of open up, be more vulnerable, and talk about these things, and ask our faith communities to say, okay, you know what, why don't we start talking about this?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, I don't think that, it's something where, we recognize death and dying, and there's, remembrance of those who have passed. There's prayers that are said for those who are sick. But there's not necessarily, I think, a prayer for the people who are dying. They're treated like they're sick, so that's probably the prayer. But I think one of the things I struggled with also was my mother was born Orthodox, into an Orthodox family, became Reformed when she married my father. And in the Jewish faith, you are not supposed to be cremated. And at this point, unfortunately, my parents had not managed their finances well. There was no planning for a funeral. There was no talking about what are we going to do when you pass away. So that was, from a financial standpoint, and sort of, it was in the middle of the pandemic. We knew we weren't going to be able to have a funeral, and so we had her cremated, and I felt a tremendous amount of guilt about that. But then I came to learn from her friend that had noticed her decline with the dementia, Norma, who was her very best friend there, had said that Mom had mentioned to her one day, "Oh, I'll probably get cremated." And I'm like, but we never talked about it. I don't know if she said it like that, but she brought up to Norma that likely might be her path. But this whole thing, if you can find, it's not humorous, but what happened was, in the hospital, they identify the body, and then they have to hold the body and wait until the funeral home sends somebody, or the person that's associated with the funeral home that will do the cremation. And I was so confused that I kept saying the name of a cemetery that was a cemetery that has a Jewish section and a non-Jewish section. And I called the right place and told them that she was going to be coming. But when I kept saying the name of the place, they wrote down the name of the cemetery. So the wrong crematory picked up my mother's body.
Oh.
And so I called Dressler's, which is where I thought she went, to check and see if she had arrived.
And she was at the
And she wasn't there. And I said to them, "What do you mean she's not there? Where is she going to go? She's dead." And so they said, "Well, maybe you need to retrace your steps." And again, so I went back to the hospital and then realized this, which, in my mind then was a fatal mistake. She was now going to be at a place not where the Jewish faith is recognized. It may have been a Christian funeral home, and then to get her back to Dressler's, they wanted $1,500, and so I don't even know if this is appropriate to be part of this discussion, but some of that, had we planned, all of this would have been mapped out. I think it would have been written down.
That's part of the hospice plan, too. When patients come on, we talk about funeral arrangements, and we designate, when they're willing to talk, try to designate a funeral home, have things mapped out. If there are rituals, I know some families like to perform a certain ritual in certain cases, or discussing cremation or discussing things openly. It is part of the planning. It's very much part of the planning.
So yeah, so
and I see the humor in it, the body going, and you're not tracking down where your mom is.
It was so crazy, but it's like, but in some respects, it's so like my mom to have a dramatic
exit.
Yeah. And not to mention, she was cremated in her mink coat. So she had a wish of how she wanted to look when she passed away, but she never wanted to talk about passing away.
Yeah. Do you have closure from this story? Do you feel like there's some part of you that is left raw and open from this?
I think that there is always going to be a part of me that wishes that I knew that 2 months before the pandemic, that instead of engaging with the psychiatrist and treating this as a mental health issue, I would have seen that as the time to engage a palliative care person. And so then things would have been different for her. I'm not suggesting that you as a physician can grant somebody more time, but I think that the progression, there would have been a prognosis and the progression of the demise of the knowing what to expect and what was going to potentially happen, and also engaging someone that would tell us we must plan.
Right. It does give more time, strikingly, not on the order of years, but it can give more time. What it does also, and I've seen this time and again, good hospice or good palliative management takes out these extreme fluctuations, and it helps people, as you said, it helps ground the process so that people understand they're not frightened as much by what's going on. They're not struggling to make sense of what's going on, but rather they say, oh, this has been seen before. Terminal agitation, once you've seen it, and it can be very, very powerful, you can give it a name. Giving things names helps tremendously. And diagnosing, I said this in my introduction to the podcast, diagnosing is critical. You can't get anywhere if you don't give things a concrete diagnosis that makes sense. So diagnosing someone can also be saying they're dying. Diagnosis can be saying, listen, we're in a phase of terminal decline. We're not reversing, and knowing also what is reversible in that decline and what's not.
Right, exactly.
Can we medicate for mood for a period of time? Again, pain management is critical too. How could we have managed, the cognitive, when you were talking about a little bit, some episodes of delirium or some episodes like that, how could those have been managed? Things along the way can be managed, and then it takes out those vacillations. But it's about diagnosis, calling it and saying, hey, this is decline and this is the dying process. And then from there, once you do that, prognosticating correctly and going, this is the amount of time. She's become non-ambulatory. She's bedbound primarily, or we're seeing her not eating or drinking, losing weight. You can start to give a prognosis around that. It's not going to be years, generally speaking. These are things that are declarations of the body that the dying process is occurring. And the dying process is not a negative. We were speaking about this at the beginning. You're born to die, meaning you're born and immediately these processes set in. So, we look like we're doing well for a period of time, but the truth is everything in us is set up on the clock. And at some point or another, depending on the circumstances, these things then kick in. And we don't have the answers, and that's where a lot of guidance from faith would help too. Whether it be Jewish faith or Christian faith or the Muslim faith or whatever faith, the Buddhist faith, it's very helpful to have acknowledgement of mortality in there and discussion of mortality so that people can turn to someone and put a spiritual meaning on that process, because it's entirely spiritual too.
So what I was going to say, so in the Jewish faith, when somebody passes away, there is a period called Shiva that you have where you invite people into your home, and that that in itself is supposed to help with I guess the end of life, and to, in some respects, it's not necessarily considered a celebration, but I think people wind up talking about stories and using a lot of humor and bringing up things that they remember about the person, and there's always food involved. And what's kind of sad is, because of the pandemic, we couldn't have that. So that's something that I feel badly about, that we weren't able to sit Shiva.
You know what I was also thinking when you just said that? I thought sometimes it's nice to even think, kind of having those celebrations of life even before, or celebration of things even before. It's a tough thing to do. An acknowledgement of the person before they even pass, but also with that, it's after the fact. I guess that was the point I was trying to make, is that these things are after the fact. And what happens before?
Yeah.
When that patient is there, both the celebration of their life when they're able to, and then also the discussion of decline and dying, the dying process while they're in the midst of it. We're not doing that part as much necessarily, right? But then we're celebrating after the fact and saying it's okay for those remaining. But you think, during the process is possibly when we need that, I don't know, something. We need something there, discussion and a lot more in terms of education probably.
I wonder if when somebody knows that they're dying, I mean, it's the idea around that is kind of scary. I know with illness, many people know that their time is nearing. With my mom, for some reason, there was sort of a flippant attitude towards the fact that she would be dead one day. But there wasn't this recognition that obviously she was in the last phase of her life, and basically the crescendo of that period is death.
Yeah. She may have known. I find that patients may know a lot more, subconsciously or consciously. And some of the things that she was saying and doing alluded to a fatigue, a readiness to allow herself to go, and being allowed the permission to go. There's probably, again, I mean, we're not in their shoes and we won't know until we get there, but it must be such a terribly difficult decision to leave behind people that you love so much. But at the same time, there's a weariness at a certain point with life, probably, in that decline, and being ready to let go, where it becomes more and more and more.
Yeah, she wouldn't have wanted to continue living in the manner in which she was living.
Yeah. Because
she wasn't able to embrace the things that she enjoyed so much.
What would you say in summary? I think this was a very incredibly powerful story. What would you say? Your mom sounds, first of all, like an absolutely fascinating woman, very proud woman who carried herself probably with quite a lot of elegance, had her children, went through a tremendous loss that probably was ineffable, not being able to speak about, or even when going to the hospital, all that trauma that came up with that. So tremendous loss. What would you say about the bigger picture, because that's why we're here today, really about the diagnosis and the prognosis portion. But in your own words, what would you say as something to give to the community, including the Jewish faith community? What would you say?
I think that it's important to call on your spiritual leaders, because they're there. That's what they're there for. And I think even in that regard, for myself, I could have utilized that for more support. I was so focused on my mom, and the whole dying process is so difficult in itself. You're trying to manage the person who is actually now, dying, but also keeping yourself intact. But I think the whole idea of the palliative care, and I really believe had her internist suggested that he turn over her to a palliative care physician, I just think her end of life would have been far more peaceful. And the stages that she went through, I'm not sure, obviously, with 100% certainty, but I don't think it would have been this dramatic.
I agree, actually. I do. I agree because I've seen both sides. It's why I wanted you to come and speak and tell your story. I think it's because it needs to be said that there can be management of decline and dying, and giving a label to the process is not a negative thing, and it can allow preparation and closure, as I said in the beginning. And then from there, you can pull back and rely on the spiritual sources that you have to give you faith through that process. But knowledge is tremendous power in that situation. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate you telling your story today.
Thank you.
I really do. I know that wasn't easy because I know that there's still a lot of raw emotion. Thank you so much for watching, and please like and subscribe and share this podcast, and we'll post any links below. Thank you again. Thanks so much, Kim.
You're
I really
welcome.
appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.